Dan Saunders slouched against the worn-out seat of a nearly empty taxi, watching the flickering streetlights blur past. The night had been long, one of those wild, unplanned adventures that stretched from dusk to dawn. His wallet, however, wasn't as lively. As the cab pulled up near an ATM, Dan reached into his pocket, fishing out his bank card. He already knew what the screen would tell him: insufficient funds. It wasn't the first time he'd seen those words, and it wouldn't be the last. But tonight was different. He tapped through the options, selecting a transfer from his credit account to his savings. $200. The machine whirred for a moment, then spit out a strange message. Transaction canceled. Dan sighed. Figures. But as he backed out of the menu, something odd caught his eye. His savings account now showed an extra $200. Confused, he checked again. Was it a glitch? A delayed transaction? He knew the bank wasn't generous enough to simply give him free money. Curiosity gnawed at him, and before logic could intervene, his fingers moved on their own. Another $200 transfer. Cancelled. Yet, there it was. His balance had jumped again. His heart pounded as he hesitated. Then, with a mix of thrill and uncertainty, he tried something bolder. $500 transfer. Cancelled. His balance swelled by another $500. Dan's breath caught in his throat. His pulse drummed in his ears. He wasn't sure what he had just stumbled upon, but one thing was certain. This night had just taken a very unexpected turn. Dan Saunders took a cautious step back from the ATM, his breath shallow. The city was quiet in the early morning haze, the only sounds coming from distant cars and the occasional chatter of late-night stragglers. He glanced around, half expecting a bank alarm to blare or a security guard to appear from the shadows. But nothing happened. The machine sat there, glowing innocently, as if it hadn't just given him free money. Was this real? His pulse raced as he stared at the screen. He needed to be sure. Slowly, methodically, he inserted his card again. This time, he increased the amount. $1,000. Transaction canceled. But the balance ticked up again. Dan exhaled sharply, barely believing his eyes. The system wasn't registering the cancellation. It was just crediting his account. He tapped his foot nervously. Should he push further? His heart pounded as he went bolder. $2,000. Cancelled. Yet, like magic, the money appeared. It was as if the ATM operated in a different dimension after midnight. A loophole. Dan could feel the adrenaline now. He wasn't a criminal. He had never even stolen so much as a candy bar. But this wasn't exactly stealing, was it? It was just there. And if the bank didn't notice, who was he to say no? The taxi driver honked impatiently, snapping Dan out of his trance. Right, he still had to pay the fare. He slid his card into the ATM one last time and withdrew a fresh stack of crisp bills. Real money. He handed a few notes to the driver, who didn't question it. To him, it was just another late-night drunk paying his way home. But Dan wasn't drunk. Not anymore. He was buzzing with something far stronger. And as the taxi sped off into the night, one thought echoed in his mind. How far can this go? The taxi rolled to a stop in front of Dan's apartment, but he barely noticed. His mind was a storm, his hands still tingling from the cold cash he had withdrawn minutes ago. He tossed a few extra bills at the driver, keep the change, and stumbled inside. Collapsing onto his couch, he stared at the ceiling, the weight of his discovery pressing down on him. He had to be smart. This wasn't just some glitch that spat out free drinks at a bar. This was money. Real money. And as far as he could tell, no one had noticed. No alarms, no warnings. So he tested it again. In the stillness of his apartment, he pulled up his banking app on his phone. The balance reflected exactly what the ATM had shown. No retractions, no corrections. It was as if the money had always been there. He exhaled slowly, His hands shook as he placed the phone down. Then a wild thought crept in. What if this isn't just a one-time thing? What if I can do it again? The moment the thought entered his mind, it refused to leave. The next night, he returned. Same ATM, same process, same result. Money appeared out of nowhere. His balance ballooned. $5,000, $10,000, $15,000. He started withdrawing in larger amounts. At first, cautiously. $500 here, $1,000 there. But as days passed and no red flags were raised, caution began to melt away. And with it, so did his old life. The first thing to go was his modest routine. No more budgeting for drinks. No more worrying about splitting bills. He picked up tabs for friends like it was nothing. "Damn, Dan, you win the lottery or something?" One of them joked after he covered yet another night out. Dan just laughed. If only they knew. Then came the hotels, the kind he'd only seen in movies. He walked into a 5-star suite one night on a whim, tossed his card at the receptionist, and booked a penthouse with a harbor view. "Do you need to check your credit limit, sir?" the receptionist asked, eyeing him curiously. Dan smirked. Not anymore. By the end of the month, he wasn't just living differently. He was living like someone else entirely. And the most dangerous part? He was loving it. Dan Saunders was no longer just another bartender scraping by. He had become something else entirely, a man untethered from financial reality, living life as if he had stumbled into a billionaire's secret playground. And it felt damn good. With every ATM visit, his confidence grew. He refined his routine, finding the perfect window of time, between midnight and 3 a.m., when the banking system seemed to be asleep, allowing his money to multiply without question. By now, his bank account balance was 6 figures, and he wasn't saving a dime. The penthouse was just the beginning. Soon, Dan started traveling on a whim, chartering private jets like they were taxis. One night, after a particularly wild party, someone jokingly suggested flying to the islands. "Let's go," Dan said without hesitation. Hours later, they were stepping off a jet onto the warm sands of Fiji. No luggage, no plans, just money and the will to spend it. He was picking up bar tabs for complete strangers, dropping tips that left waiters in shock. His generosity made him a legend in certain circles. A mystery man who had seemingly come out of nowhere, throwing money around like it meant nothing. And to him, it didn't. The thrill wasn't just in spending, it was in the freedom. No limits, no responsibilities, no nagging voice telling him to slow down. But there was another feeling creeping in, lurking just beneath the surface. A faint, nagging unease. Because deep down, Dan knew this couldn't last forever. The money wasn't real. The lifestyle wasn't real. He was living inside a house of cards built on borrowed time. Yet every time doubt tried to creep in, he shoved it away. If no one's stopping me, why stop myself? So he kept going, bigger, wilder, louder. Until one day, Dan did something that would change everything, something he couldn't take back. Dan Saunders had spent months living like a king, burning through cash like it was infinite. But what he didn't realize was that the higher you climb, the further you have to fall. And his fall was about to begin. It started as a simple idea, something so small, so insignificant at first. Dan had always been generous with his money, picking up tabs, covering friends' expenses, even paying off a few student loans. He liked the rush of giving. It made him feel invincible, like some kind of modern-day Robin Hood. So when a friend, someone he barely knew, mentioned they were in a tight spot financially, Dan did what had become second nature to him. He wired them $20,000. No second thoughts, no hesitation. And that was his biggest mistake. Unlike cash withdrawals, wire transfers didn't slip through the cracks. They left a trail, a digital footprint that led straight back to him. For months, he had stayed under the radar, moving money through the quiet hours of the night, making sure he never did anything that could alert the bank's fraud detection systems. But this was different. Days later, something unusual happened. His ATM card stopped working. At first, he brushed it off. Maybe the system had finally caught up to the glitch. Maybe it was a minor issue. But when he checked his banking app, his heart stopped. Account frozen. Pending investigation. Dan felt a chill crawl up his spine. They knew. For the first time in months, panic set in. His chest tightened as a dozen questions flooded his mind. Had they been watching him this whole time? Had they tracked every withdrawal, every flight, every lavish night out? His phone buzzed. A notification. A legal notice from the National Australia Bank. Dan's breath caught in his throat. The dream was over. Dan Saunders stared at the notification on his phone, his fingers numb. His heart pounded so hard it felt like it might burst from his chest. He had always known this day would come. He just didn't think it would happen so soon. His mind raced through 1,000 scenarios. Run, hide, deny, fight. But deep down, he already knew the truth. There was no way out. He had spent months testing fate, daring the universe to stop him. And now, the universe had answered. The following days were a blur of paranoia. Every knock at the door sent his pulse skyrocketing. Every unfamiliar face in a crowd made him second-guess reality. Then, the phone calls started. The bank wanted answers. Investigators were looking into irregular transactions. Dan did what he could. He stalled, he dodged, he pretended he didn't know what they were talking about. But it didn't matter. The trail he had left behind was undeniable, and soon the authorities came knocking. Sitting in an interrogation room, Dan finally faced the consequences of his actions. The questions came fast and sharp. When did it start? How much did he take? Did he know it was illegal? Of course he did. Yet, as he sat there, stripped of his luxury, stripped of the power that money had given him, he felt something he hadn't felt in months. Relief. The chase was over. The stress, the paranoia, the endless waiting for the other shoe to drop. It was done. Dan Saunders was sentenced to 1 year in prison for fraud. The judge acknowledged that he hadn't hacked or stolen. He had simply exploited a flaw. But the law didn't care about loopholes. Once, he had everything he could ever want. Now, he had nothing. But strangely enough, in the silence of his prison cell, he felt something unexpected. Peace. For the first time in a long time, he wasn't looking over his shoulder. His empire of illusions had crumbled. And for the first time, he was free.